So welcome back to the Future of X. I'm joined by Julian Waters-Lynch today. Julian is an industry fellow in innovation and entrepreneurship at RMIT University in Melbourne and has also recently published his PhD on a theory of co-working, entrepreneurial communities in material commons and working futures. Hi, Julian. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Ben, great to be here. Great to return the favour.
We've just been having a great conversation, prior to this call about the future of work in general, and I guess as it relates to your topic of expertise, I'm really interested in the future of co-working. There are perhaps a lot of ideas floating around with big co-working companies now sort of approaching some degree of maturity. What do you see as the future of co-working, and how has co-working itself evolved from, as you described it in your PhD, a novel solution to the problems of the knowledge economy?
Yeah, I find this question really interesting because shared office arrangements didn't begin with co-working, as most people know. There were companies. One of the earliest companies that's actually Australian, Servcorp, in the 1970s, had what used to be called Regis in the 1980s. So the notion of service offices and shared work arrangements, when Brad Nelberg coined this term, co-working, it really had very little to do with real estate. It was an organic bottom-up solution by independent knowledge workers, largely freelancers at that time, to a new set of problems that had emerged because of the internet, because of digitally independent work, digitally location independent work, and the social issues around isolation and loneliness and lack of professional or collegiate community. So it began as actually a direct response to going to Regis. A lot of people don't know this. It's kind of ironic, really, because now these companies say they do co-working, but Brad, this guy who was a coder in San Francisco, went to one of these service offices and basically said, this totally sucks. No one's talking to each other. The environment's cold. The atmosphere's horrible. I'm going to start this thing called co-working that will be all about people and locality and proximity and interaction. And it was largely ignored by real estate incumbents or sneered at a little bit in the media for years. But what we've seen in the last 7 or 8 years, really mapping to the rise of WeWork and the extreme valuations of WeWork, is a kind of rebirth of the service office industry. So co-working spaces in the early days were largely open plan, kind of do-it-yourself, lo-fi environments, often in old industrial warehouses and things, populated principally by solo self-employed freelancers, sometimes called businesses with no employees. So it was a solution to their social and knowledge work issues. But we've seen the re-territorialization of these spaces by private offices. Now, there's a market reason for that, because you make more money and there's more stable tenure, etc. But that early form of co-working that involved a lot of self-organization amongst these communities has faded a lot from the larger co-working spaces. It's still there, and that's what I find interesting. So I haven't answered your question precisely, which is what is the future of co-working, but I picked up on that last bit of how has co-working changed. So we've got now the word co-working is associated with largely, I would say, service office industry. That's fine. And it looks different than it did in the 80s. They have free beer and kombucha and all the rest, ping pong tables and events and things. But the majority of the inventory is private offices, and you don't see a lot of interaction between these small businesses because they're busy working on their thing. What I think is interesting is where that solution space goes for independent workers. And so I can talk to a set of experiments I see going on there, but I'll pause it for a second and wait for your next question.
No, I really appreciate the knowledge you've got on the evolution of the space, and I think you're absolutely right. In fact, I saw a floor plate for co-working space recently, and it looked almost identical to the floor plate of an office that had been designed in the 1960s. Almost completely cellular offices, walled off, and not at all what we associate with a modern office these days. But perhaps that, in fact, is a more sophisticated way of doing it, because there are so many other problems with activity-based and open work environments as well. But that's not the question I wanted to ask. I'm interested in this notion that you have of immaterial commons, and perhaps if you think about the independent knowledge workers that you were describing, I think they actually have similar problems to individuals within large companies. In a sense, they're trying to navigate what they know, how they work with people that they maybe don't know, how they find things to do. And as work becomes a little bit more complex, perhaps we're going to see the same sorts of problems that independent freelancers face being faced by people in large companies as well. How would you approach that? What are the new problems of work, and how do immaterial commons perhaps help with those things?
Yeah, so there's a few questions bundled in there, and they would take me in different directions. Maybe I'll begin with this notion of immaterial commons, because it sounds like a nerdy sociological term, but if I define it, so there's a tradition in economics, or there's a theoretical trajectory in economics called commons that begins with Elinor Ostrom, and it was very much picked up by media theorists in the 90s to explain things like Wikipedia and Linux, because these phenomena were created by a community of people coming together, and in the digital case, they really created these resources, and they were able to be freely accessed or used. They didn't have the standard property rights, or they weren't locked up by IP. And Wikipedia is the case most people are familiar with. If you try to pay people to do that, it would be phenomenally expensive, prohibitively expensive. It's able to function and maintain itself as this distributed aggregation of knowledge work, because one of the reasons is because it's a non-profit venture. That Jimmy Wales isn't sticking advertising dollars on there, exploiting that labour. It sits as this common pool of resources. So what I noticed, if we go back to our early freelancer case, and the early phase of co-working from those sort of 2005 and 6 to probably 2012, a lot of these spaces themselves, they were open. It was, as I said, individuals coming in there. The infrastructure of the space wasn't that extensive. There wasn't tons of value in the chairs and the furniture and the office infrastructure. A lot of the value that co-workers were finding was in what they created themselves. It was in aggregating and sharing knowledge resources, and more specifically, or I think interestingly, and it's a bit more subtle, it's sharing the atmosphere, sharing a set of affective resources, the vibe, to put it in colloquial terms. And we all know this. It seems weird in business world to talk about the vibe as an economic resource, and at the same time, it's such a common thing to walk into a place and go, I didn't like the vibe, or I really like the vibe. If you interview people about their experiences in co-working, their language is saturated with this term. There's something about that place. I just love the vibe. And then if you break that down, they'll say, well, it's the building, and it's the plants, and it's the music, and it's the smell. But it's also, or more importantly, it's the way people respond to me there. It's their smiles and their body language and their propensity to respond to me in positive ways. It's something I said just triggered Siri, so she must have heard a Siri in there. So so that's the immaterial part, affective and knowledge resources. I rather provocatively put that forward as a comment, because I think it is a bit problematic when a private co-working space as well, we can sell you access to this stuff. And I actually think this has set up a whole set of problems in the co-working world, which I could go into. I'm probably getting to the edge of my time limit. But framing it as a commons puts a different, it directs the spotlight of attention to a different place. The co-workers themselves are an integral part of the creation of these resources, and therefore, just as when we think about social media platforms, it's actually the users of these platforms themselves that create a lot of the value. And we're having a conversation now around Facebook and other major digital social media providers that there are problems around the free labor and the exploitation of that data for marketing ends. I'm provocatively proposing and alliterating that selling atmospheres in co-working spaces when that atmosphere is created by co-workers themselves is a similar uncomfortable ethical challenge, I think. So I could go into more about it, but really that's why the commons itself is an interesting concept to put this around. And it resonates a lot with people when they've been in those spaces or felt disaffected by those spaces. It probably wouldn't be a popular term with co-working space providers because it reframes the ethics and politics of what they're doing in a way that doesn't paint them in the best light.
Yeah. I think, interestingly, what you were describing before as the vibe, I think in a large company or an incumbent with an existing office, they might describe, aspects of that as the culture of the company. But equally, there's more in that definition of the vibe than simply interactions. It's also got to do with the physicality and the place and the actual design of that space that people are in. And I think those have implications for how large companies design their workplaces and consider the notion of, using a co-working provider for within the real estate industry, what's called as flex space. But we all know that it's actually more than just the flexibility of the balance sheet. It's also, playing into the nature of how the company itself works. So that, I guess I'm saying by way of setting up the last question, and that is, I think what we're going to see is these definitions kind of either merge or start to fade away. And as you put it before, perhaps we stop thinking of co-working as a really novel thing. It just becomes how we work. And then in the future, we're going to face new problems that are created by the unbundling of the workplace and the workspace. So, how could a incumbent or how could a large company that's navigating these challenges of, whether to use flex space or co-working as part of their solution deal with creating their own commons? How do they access that space? Is it something that they can even do?
Well, I had an answer prepared until you said that last sentence. That's a challenge. Although I do see interesting experiments in this field. So when you turn up as with a standard employment contract, and I feel like the relationship is a little cleaner there, right? If you're producing value for the company, now individuals navigate this trade-off between value in their own role that they'll be accredited for, they will hit their KPIs and helping other people. There can sometimes be a trade-off there. But I would say the fortune of the company at the best of times is tied to your own prospects as well. And in the best cases, you have equity or there's some sort of stake in the success of the company, performance-based metrics or whatever. Why I think it's more acute in a co-working space is because you're really, through one lens, you're a customer, right? And so you're paying to be there, and yet you're also, through various forms of immaterial labor, visible labor, there's different terms for this, emotional labor, you're also creating value and contributing to it. And if you don't do that, the vibe decreases, which is actually what I think we've seen in a lot of co-working spaces. If you then go, okay, this is a common pool of resources, and I'm part of this, I have a stake in this, then I think co-workers in that case, or workers in another case, should have a stake in the success of the company. If it's sold and you get no benefits from that, that doesn't seem right to me. In fact, there's a really interesting Twitter thread about WeWork at the moment. I think she was employee, I don't know, number 10 or something.
Yeah, I've seen that one.
You've seen that one?
Yeah.
And she goes through it, and she does it quite well. She's not bitter. overly acrimonious about it, but she does talk about the difficulty of feeling she was an early part of WeWork's success but was never offered equity, and she's reflecting on how different her life might be today, or at least if they do go ahead and IPO, if she had fought a little bit harder or been less naive about her, I don't know if entitlement is too strong a term here, but receiving equity in the company. Mm-hmm. So there's a basic question like that of when we're contributing to things and when we're actually integral to the valuation of certain forms of enterprise, what is the stake that we have in that? Now, if we're talking in that world, I think there are interesting experiments in Spiral and these various entrepreneurial coalitions around the world that are trying to work this out at a governance and stake level. And the crypto world, the world of crypto tokens and things, has provided, I guess, a new set of digital infrastructure, technological infrastructures, where people are trialing these experiments. But your question was around, can standard companies build an immaterial commons, and would it be a commons? I'm not so sure about that. I want to address your point about what does co-working look like when the term almost fades away?
Yeah.
Because it's tempting, if I look at the academic literature on co-working, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff in the building sort of sector, smart buildings, etc. A bunch of stuff funding on libraries, some stuff in organizational studies, but there's a whole bunch of stuff in geography and urban studies around it as a sort of informal practice for a coping practice of freelancers, a response to precarious work conditions. And a lot of the literature almost laments the direction co-working's gone. Being academics, we're interested in these social responses in the early phase, and I think there was some glimmers of hope that that what was happening in co-working spaces in the early days represented a emergent form of new class solidarity, like a freelance class that would bundle together and support each other in these forms of mutual aid. And what they would often call the neo corporate version of co-working, represented by WeWork and these other factors, certainly hasn't gone that way. It's gone the venture capital, tech, high valuation, massive backing of some suspect money at times, looking for a big payoff, which will make a small bunch of people very, very rich, and a lot of those early employees will be off on other precarious journeys. So if I go to the other extreme of that, the non-lamenting, the interesting social experiment extreme, and just go, consider, okay, what does this thing look like when it is just a way of working? It's just 5-10 years, it's completely, there's no sense that just because you have a job, you need to go to the place of work. You need to go to the building that company is associated with. I think that's an interesting thing to consider, right? And this has been on the cards in some ways for decades under telecommuting. It's you mentioned in our previous conversation, the paperless office has been one of these chimerical things. It's been discussed for decades and never quite happened. Yeah. It may be, in some ways, I think the dream of telecommuting being the norm has some unthought through assumptions in it. But what I can imagine is a place where there's been a much more advanced unbundling between the place you go to work for your and who your employer is. And if I think as the standard job in the 20th century, so the standard employment contract, has been the site for a combination of elements, your financial remuneration, your sort of physical infrastructure, digital infrastructure, and then this social space, social learning and career advancement and maybe even a personal meaning and moral order space. If they were at the best of times co-inhabitating a physical environment, factory or an office where your colleagues would be there, and presumably your professional learning pathway would be there, and your future career, etc., where you get your money from. Maybe at the worst of times, they'll bundle, but sometimes this was good. If I think of these as spheres moving apart now, so people have a physical place and a set of office infrastructure, a place they'll go to work. They have a place they're getting money from. It might be a single employer. It might be a portfolio of income streams. I think these other two are really interesting. So this social sphere that might be people that feel like colleagues, a professional community that may overlap strongly with a learning community. In my case, it often does. So you would be part of that for me. You know, you're someone that we get together, we hang out, and we might be talking about work or life, but this layer of learning and discovery is often there. And then people also have these communities of meaning and purpose, right? So people might identify with a B Corp community, and they want to talk to other founders or entrepreneurs that have B Corps. I think the notion that these things are in relationship but not cohabiting is quite interesting. It sets up a new set of problems in navigating the trade-offs between these communities at times, and the tension between them, because you can't be in two places at once physically. Not yet. And yet it also sets up a new set of opportunities. So ending on your point about how does the company embrace this, if the sense is setting up avenues for novel information to travel inside your company, kind of foundation for innovation in information processing theory, this goes right back to the weak ties thesis of Mark Granovetter, right? You want lots of these novel avenues for information to travel inside your company. That could be a very good thing, but you also need a coherence mechanism. You also need a way of digesting this stuff and metabolizing its value. We all know if just getting bombarded with novel information can be overwhelming. It can be counterproductive. It might be necessary for innovation, but it's certainly not sufficient. So that's where I see the challenges, both taking advantage of distributed workforce, but understanding their worlds. That when people are sitting in a co-working space, for example, don't know what they'll be called in 10 years, but they're actually exposed to a different overlapping set of people, of social relationships, and that's going to have an effect on them. That might pull them in different directions. That will involve giving up some, if you ever had any sense of control, whatever's left, it will involve releasing some of that. So there's a bunch of stuff and thoughts that come to mind.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Julian. I really appreciate it, because every time we have a conversation, it usually generates at least 5 more necessary conversations to fully digest everything. And I wanted to use this really as a jumping off point for some of those conversations. If people are interested in learning more about what you're working on or what you're publishing about, where's the best place to go? How can they get in touch with you, and where do you see your outputs being located?
Yeah, well, this is where I go, man, I really should set up and make this more accessible. So, I mean, I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn or Twitter, and just because there's no other Waters-Lynches in the world, at least that I found. It's a good child of divorce. There's Waterses and Lynches, but there's only one Julian Waters-Lynch. In academia, just where I'm at in my career at the moment is one of the things that annoys people outside of academia, but is highly valorized within academia, is getting published in these top journals. So a lot of my work at the moment isn't that visible to the outside world. It's sitting under reviews. But what I'll start doing in the next year is start publishing more digestible forms of these ideas. This is something, I've got a paper under review called The Affective Commons of Coworking. It's all written in very obtuse language of sociology. And yet the basic idea at the heart of that paper is how can we think about the vibe in a way that's meaningful as an economic resource? And once we conceptualize that and accept that, what does that mean for its management? How do you manage the vibe? Yeah, I mean, it's hard enough to manage knowledge, but managing this sort of diffuse affective resource like that is interesting. So yeah, LinkedIn, Twitter is an easy place to find me for now.
Amazing. Well, I'll put a couple of links to those locations in the notes, and look forward to starting a vibe design practice with you.
Vibe design. There you go. Cool, man.
Thanks, Julian.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers.